In 2011, a geneticist in Italy sat with a laptop full of numbers she did not expect to see, and for a moment she simply stopped scrolling. The data belonged to a small population living in the marshlands of southern Iraq, and it was not supposed to look like this. It was too uniform, too concentrated, too much like a signal instead of noise. That single afternoon in a lab at the University of Pavia would eventually reopen one of the oldest unanswered questions in human history. What happened to the Sumerians, the people who invented writing, cities and law, and then simply vanished from the biological record? For nearly 2 centuries, the disappearance of the Sumerians was treated as a settled matter. Historians assumed that a civilization this influential must have left descendants somewhere, and the working theory was tidy. The Sumerians grew directly out of the Ubaid culture, the farming communities that had worked the marshes and floodplains of southern Mesopotamia for thousands of years before the first cities rose at Uruk and Eridu. It was the same pattern scholars used everywhere else. Egyptians traced to Nile Valley farmers, Greeks traced to Mycenaeans, Romans traced to Etruscans and Latins. Sumerians, the textbooks said, traced to the Ubaid. Case closed, no further questions needed. Except the Sumerians never quite fit that mold, and the cracks had been visible for a long time to anyone willing to look. Sumerian is what linguists call a language isolate, meaning it has no known relatives, living or dead, anywhere on Earth. Every other major ancient language belongs to some family tree you can trace outward. Sumerian belongs to nothing. Its cuneiform writing also appears at Uruk in a startlingly mature form, without the messy, halting evolution you would expect from a system being invented for the first time. Scholars had a name for this bundle of inconsistencies. They called it the Sumerian problem, and for most of the 20th century, it was treated less as a mystery to solve and more as a footnote to tolerate. The reason nobody solved it earlier has less to do with laziness than with geography. To answer a question like this, geneticists normally do the obvious thing. They dig up bones and read the DNA preserved inside them. That method has worked beautifully elsewhere. Researchers have pulled genomes from Neanderthal remains tens of thousands of years old in the caves of Europe, from woolly mammoths frozen in permafrost, from early farmers in Anatolia and the Levant. Cold, dry, stable environments protect genetic material for millennia. Southern Mesopotamia offers none of that. It is scorching, humid, and low-lying, and the combination of heat and moisture is close to a worst-case scenario for DNA preservation. Bone buried in that soil tends to become brittle and chemically damaged within a relatively short span of time, and whatever genetic material survives is usually shattered into fragments too degraded to sequence. After more than a century of archaeological work in the region, the amount of usable ancient DNA recovered from the Sumerian heartland is close to zero. This creates one of the strangest imbalances in archaeology. The Sumerians left behind more written material than almost any other ancient people. Tens of thousands of clay tablets survive, recording everything from creation myths and king lists to barley shipments and beer recipes. We know they divided time into units of 60, the same system that still shapes how we read a clock today. We know their irrigation canals, their law codes, their temple economies, their gods. And yet, for all of that, not a single confirmed skeleton has yielded a usable Sumerian genome. A civilization that built its identity around the written record left almost nothing behind in the other record, the one written in the language of the cell. So the researchers who wanted an answer had to improvise, and the idea that eventually took shape was elegant in its simplicity. If you cannot recover ancient DNA from the Sumerians directly, you can instead study the people who still live on the same land, under conditions the Sumerians themselves would recognize. In the marshes where the Tigris and Euphrates converge before reaching the Persian Gulf, there is a community that fits that description almost perfectly, known as the Marsh Arabs, or Maden. They build reed houses using techniques that appear in Sumerian art from 4,000 years ago. Their boat designs, their waterways, their way of organizing daily life around the marsh ecosystem, all echo practices that predate recorded history in that specific location. If any living population still carried a genetic trace of the Sumerians, archaeologists reasoned, it would most likely be this one. That reasoning led to the 2011 study led by geneticist Nadia Al-Zahiri and colleagues, published through research affiliated with the University of Pavia, which analyzed Y-chromosome and mitochondrial DNA from a sample of Marsh Arab men, each with several generations of documented ancestry in the region. The maternal line, inherited through mitochondrial DNA, showed what researchers expected, a fairly typical Middle Eastern genetic mixture. The paternal line, inherited through the Y chromosome, told a very different story. A large majority of the men sampled, roughly 3/4, carried the same specific paternal lineage, a branch known as J1p58. When related J lineages were grouped together, they accounted for the overwhelming majority of the male ancestry in the sample. That level of genetic uniformity is unusual for any human population. Most groups carry a wide mix of paternal lines shaped by centuries of migration, intermarriage, and trade. Finding one lineage dominating so completely suggests that, at some point, a relatively small number of men had a disproportionately large impact on the population's future gene pool. The next question was where that lineage originated, and the answer complicated the story rather than simplifying it. Geneticists estimate a lineage's place of origin by looking for the region where it shows the greatest internal diversity, since a lineage accumulates more distinct mutations the longer it has existed in one place. When researchers mapped J1p58 this way, its center of diversity did not point to the southern marshes at all. It pointed north, toward upper Mesopotamia and southeastern Anatolia, with fainter genetic threads extending toward the Arabian Peninsula, the Horn of Africa, and the eastern Mediterranean. In other words, the dominant paternal lineage among the people most closely associated with the Sumerians did not appear to originate where the Sumerians eventually built their cities. It appeared to have moved in from somewhere else, likely flowing down from the highlands into the river plains over a long period of time. Researchers also tried to estimate when this lineage expanded rapidly, since a sudden population boom leaves a detectable genetic signature. Using mutation rate calculations, the Al-Zahiri team estimated an expansion date of roughly 4,500 years ago. That number lines up almost too neatly with the height of Sumerian civilization, the era of Uruk, Ur, and Lagash, when cities were growing to unprecedented size, monumental ziggurats were under construction, and cuneiform writing had matured into a full administrative system. It is tempting to read that overlap as confirmation, as if the DNA were recording the exact moment Sumerian civilization was born. But responsible science requires caution here, and the researchers themselves urged it. The dating method used carries a substantial margin of error, wide enough that the true expansion could have happened thousands of years earlier or, just as plausibly, well after Sumerian civilization had already collapsed. A number that convenient deserves scrutiny rather than celebration, and to their credit, the scientists who produced it did not oversell it as proof. A second, more direct piece of the puzzle arrived in 2022, when a research team led by population geneticist Iosif Lazaridis, working in collaboration with several international institutions, managed to recover the first confirmed Neolithic-era genomes from Mesopotamia, drawn from sites in the northern part of the region where climate conditions were slightly less destructive to ancient remains. This was a genuine breakthrough, because it offered, for the first time, direct genetic evidence from the deep past rather than an inference built entirely from living populations. What the team found appended the old assumption of a single, self-contained local ancestry. The early farming populations of northern Mesopotamia were not one uniform group quietly developing in isolation. They were already a blend of at least 3 distinct ancestral streams, drawing from hunter-gatherer populations in the Levant, from groups associated with the Caucasus, and from a substantial eastern component connected to the Zagros Mountains, along the western edge of what is now Iran. That eastern Zagros component turned out to be significant, because it meant the very Ubaid culture long treated as the pure, native root of Sumerian civilization was itself already a genetic mixture, shaped by highland populations moving down into the plains long before any city existed. The floodplain was not the ultimate source of Mesopotamian identity. It was closer to a destination, a place where different migratory currents converged over centuries and eventually settled into the population that would go on to build Uruk and Eridu. This detail carries an almost poetic weight when set beside Sumerian mythology itself, which repeatedly locates the origin of its gods and the gifts of civilization in mountains to the east. For a long time, scholars filed that recurring motif away as symbolic language, a poetic flourish rather than a literal memory. The genetic data does not prove those myths were historical record, but it does show that the directional instinct in Sumerian storytelling, the pull toward the eastern highlands, lines up with a real and documented migratory pattern. If the story stopped there, it would already be remarkable. But the picture becomes more layered when you widen the lens from the isolated Marsh Arab community to the Iraqi population as a whole. Broader Iraqi genetic surveys show a much more varied paternal landscape than the Marshes alone. The J lineage share drops substantially, while other haplogroups linked to Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, along with additional lineages associated with later Semitic-speaking populations, make up a meaningful share of the total. This diversity reflects roughly 4,000 years of subsequent history, as Akkadians, Amorites, Assyrians, Babylonians, Persians, the armies of Alexander, later Arab tribes, Mongol incursions, and Ottoman administration all left successive genetic layers across the region. What stands out in the broader research is an asymmetry between paternal and maternal lineages. A meaningfully larger share of Iraqi Y-chromosome lineages trace to outside populations compared to the share of mitochondrial lineages with outside origins. The most straightforward explanation is one rooted in ordinary historical patterns of conquest and trade, where incoming soldiers, administrators, and merchants were disproportionately male, while the resident population, particularly its women, remained rooted in place across generations. That means the maternal line, passed mother to daughter across thousands of years, has functioned as an unusually stable genetic anchor, carrying forward a Mesopotamian signature that predates the rise and fall of nearly every empire that marched through the region afterward. When researchers strip away the more recent paternal layers contributed by later invasions and trade networks, they consistently find a shared underlying genetic foundation connecting Marsh Arabs, broader Iraqi populations, and other historic communities of the region, including Assyrians, Iraqi Jews, and Mandeans, groups separated by religion and language but united by a common ancient root. None of this amounts to a clean, triumphant discovery of Sumerian DNA sitting untouched in a modern population. The honest version of the story is more complicated and more interesting than that. The near uniformity of the J1P58 lineage among Marsh Arabs could reflect genuine ancient population history, but it could also be explained, at least partly, by genetic drift, the gradual loss of lineage diversity that happens naturally in small, relatively isolated communities over many centuries, regardless of who their distant ancestors were. Closeness to the Sumerians in cultural practice does not automatically guarantee closeness in ancestry. Researchers have been careful to acknowledge this distinction rather than paper over it, and that caution is itself a sign the underlying science deserves to be taken seriously. What ties the entire investigation together is not a single triumphant number, but a pattern that keeps reappearing across independent lines of evidence. Ancient genomic research into the Zagros region, including work examining populations across roughly 3,000 years spanning the Bronze Age through the Persian imperial period, suggests that the eastern highland populations connected to early Mesopotamian ancestry were not a one-time migratory wave that dissolved and disappeared. They persisted as a distinct, traceable presence across an extraordinarily long stretch of time, coexisting alongside, and periodically mixing with, the lowland populations of the Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Persian worlds. The connection between mountain and plain was not a single ancient event remembered only in myth. It was a relationship sustained across millennia. And that leaves one final contradiction sitting at the center of the whole investigation, the one that refuses to resolve neatly. Linguistically, the Sumerians appear to be among the most isolated people in recorded history, speaking a language with no relatives anywhere on the family tree of human speech. Genetically, they appear to be almost the opposite, an outcome shaped by continuous mixing among Levantine, Anatolian, and Zagros populations over thousands of years. A people can be linguistically unique while being genetically deeply interconnected with their neighbors, and the Sumerians are perhaps history's clearest demonstration of exactly that. Their words came from nowhere anyone has been able to trace. Their blood came from nearly everywhere around them. The piece still missing from this puzzle is the most obvious one. Every conclusion described here has been built from proxies, from the DNA of the living rather than direct samples from Sumerian remains themselves. Until researchers manage to recover confirmed ancient DNA from within the historical boundaries of Sumer itself, From beneath sites like Uruk, Ur, or Eridu, this entire reconstruction remains an inference, however well supported. And recovering that DNA faces obstacles that have nothing to do with willingness or funding. Many of the most promising archaeological sites lie beneath modern cities, in regions affected by decades of conflict, or under permit restrictions that have stalled excavation for years. Even where access exists, the same brutal climate that destroyed the genetic record the first time is still sitting in the ground, waiting to do the same thing to any future attempt. What this research ultimately offers is not a final verdict, but a genuinely humbling correction to 2 centuries of oversimplified thinking. The Sumerians were never a mysterious people who arrived from nowhere, and they were never a pure, self-contained population that grew in isolation from one patch of riverbank. They were the product of an extended, layered convergence, highland migrants meeting lowland farmers, over a span of time long enough that by the moment writing appears in the archaeological record, the population producing it was already a blend centuries in the making. Perhaps the right question was never where the Sumerians came from, but how a civilization that inventive could be built from people who were never one thing to begin with. And there is something quietly moving in the final shape of this discovery. The Sumerians did not vanish the way we usually imagine lost civilizations vanishing, swallowed by silence and sand. Their language died, replaced first by Akkadian, then Aramaic, then Arabic. Their cities crumbled into mounds that farmers walked over for thousands of years without knowing what lay beneath their feet. But the biological thread, however diluted, however layered over by later history, appears to have never fully broken. It persisted through the maternal lines of ordinary families who stayed on that land through every empire that rose and fell above them. Somewhere in the blood of people living along the Tigris and Euphrates today, carrying no memory of the name Sumer at all, an ancient signature seems to have quietly endured, waiting, in a sense, for science to finally learn how to read.